Hi, I'm finally getting to know this technology a little better. So I want to just share with you a little trick before we start lecture 5. First of all, I'm now able to load everything into the media gallery in B-Courses. So this is what B-Courses looks like to you, I believe. And if we go down this list, we see media gallery. And if you click on that and you wait patiently, I spend all my time waiting, you'll see here it says creation date descending. I wish I could figure out how to change that, but I can't. So what you need to do is go alphabetically, A to Z. I wish it would just stay that way, but it doesn't. But if you do that, the lectures, I titled them all so they would be in perfect order, because I know it's a little complicated. Some lectures have one part, some lectures have two, etc. So 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, 2 is a monster, isn't it? 2C, and then I had to divide 2C, the caption version, in half because it was just too big. I also put caption. I'm only keeping the caption versions up here. If that's a problem for anyone, let me know. Caption 2D, 2E, my goodness. Then we have 3A and 3B and 4. And shortly, we'll have 5 and 5B. That's a very short 2-minute thing that you might enjoy related to our lecture. And then the field trips and lab videos go to the bottom because they begin with L for lab. So here's lab 1, the grass experiment. And here's lab 2, my field trip with the steamy GoPro. All right. So let's get started on our lecture. Burning and herbivory and how they relate to ecosystem change. We've emphasized herbivory a little bit, so here we'll be talking mostly about burning. You'll recall that this is the equilibrium model, a diagram of the equilibrium model for explaining ecosystem change, and you'll see this emphasizes these biotic interactions between the animals and the plants. The grazing animal grazes the plant community, which is the scale at which we're working often. The plant community responds, and that in turn affects the grazing animal. So in other words, if there's quote unquote overgrazing or overuse of the plant community can't quite regrow enough. And so it doesn't quite produce the same amount as we go through this cycle, and the grazing animals don't have enough to eat. So some of the grazing animals fail to reproduce or they die, and that causes them to not be able to remove as much plant material, and the plants grow more abundantly. And then there's extra food for the grazing animals, and the grazing animals grow again. And the philosophy, or the way this model affects management planning, is that we seek this balance where the animals aren't taking too many of the plants, and the plants can regrow vigorously and feed the animals. And that should be the essence of sustainability, that there's this relationship between the two. So that assumption is that the relationships here, the biotic ones, including the fact that if a grazing animal eats one plant and not another, it'll have a competitive advantage. These impacts, where we look at all the biotic relationships, mean that we're seeking a stable set of those relationships. And the stability, if you remember that, we call that trying to reach an equilibrium or climax in the other successional models that we've been talking about. We want a stable, consistent system. And grazing, we've tried to do this all over the world with grazing, with wildlife management, with other things as well. And in many cases, it hasn't panned out. Things don't seem to ever come into balance, or the balance is short-lived. Every ecosystem has times when it doesn't work, but in some ecosystems, it hardly ever works. And we need a different model for that. But on this equilibrium-based model where we're seeking this balance, or we think we should be seeking this balance in biotic conditions, and the ecological site and the weather and climate have effects, but not so importantly, kind of falls apart sometimes. And one of the reasons is because, for example, in California, we have this tremendously variable and unreliable rainfall. And that means that the balance can't ever quite get perfect, can't quite look the way we'd like it to look. Because if there's no rain, it doesn't matter whether we have too few or too many animals. The plants are not going to grow. And if it rains a lot, which it does sometimes, then the plants will grow a lot and we won't have enough animals or wildlife to consume it. So this has led us to the other model, the non-equilibrium model, which is represented here, where there's still a relationship between the grazing animal and the plant community, and it's still important, just like weather is important in the equilibrium model, but it's not the usual main driver of the system. What are these abiotic factors, weather and climate, arid, unpredictable, and the ecological site, which is why we're spending so much time learning about ecological sites. And a typical other abiotic factor that influences this system is fire in an arid environment, especially when it has a lot of biomass. California is kind of unique because in the United States, because despite the fact that rainfall is rather low, it still produces so much biomass because we have a mild winter with rainfall often, not always. And the other point here is with the non-equilibrium, or sometimes called the disequilibrium model, where a balance is almost impossible to achieve, there isn't these stabilizing feedbacks. The coupled system is another way that people talk about the relationship between the plants and the animals. They're coupled because they have this feedback relationship. We can go back and look at that. I think coupled is a good word to understand. This relationship is too disturbed in a non-equilibrium type of model and in a system that's explained by a non-equilibrium model where abiotic factors have such a big influence. So this is coupled because in this model, because the grazing animal and the plant community are connected by these quote unquote stabilizing feedbacks that I described. But in a non-equilibrium or disequilibrium model, they're not coupled. And the other frustrating thing about a non-equilibrium model is that the weather and the climate are not amenable to management. We can't manage weather and climate. We can't manage the ecological site. We can manage fire, and we can also not manage fire. We have both versions of that, right? And we have managed herbivory, where we're using domestic animals that we can control, and we have herbivory that's harder to manage of everything else that eats plants, and including the big game. The large ungulates are often controlled by hunting. But flexibility, adaptation, dealing with it, these are the hallmarks of a non-equilibrium environment. Sometimes it's having extra food, as hay or grain. Sometimes it's mobility, that's the traditional way, pre-cultivation or without cultivation. Just moving vast distances is another way of adapting and coping. Unfortunately, as our world becomes more crowded and agriculture spreads, crop agriculture, grazing is agriculture, crop agriculture spreads, both wildlife and domestic animals are increasingly unable to be as mobile as they were before. So here's a couple important questions for the course. Which kind of model, equilibrium or non-equilibrium, explains rangeland ecosystem dynamics better and allows us to predict what will happen over time? Well, we know that that is variable in any spot. There are still some equilibrium type models that might fit specific spots where there's consistent source of water, like along a stream, and other spots where it doesn't, upland, dry range, no. What are the dynamics of different ecological sites, and what does that imply for our ability to predict ecological response to these drivers of the ecosystem state? Well, we're going to find that the equilibrium model fits the tall grass and midgrass prairie better than the non-equilibrium model. And so the ecological sites we have there will have a different dynamic than the ecological sites in California or Nevada or the Southwest, which tend to fall into the non-equilibrium category. Drivers, herbivory, fire, climate change, and weather. Boy, we're seeing all that come together right now, aren't we? Let's talk about these drivers of ecosystem change and compare them. Herbivory and fire, weather and climate change. How much control do we have over each? What do they control? What do they affect the most? Do they have selectivity like livestock do, where they pick one thing and not another? How fast does the change caused by them occur? And what are the effects? And what would it cost to do it? So with wild herbivory, control is pretty medium. In other words, it's usually controlled by hunting. And that's not as certain as the control of domestic animals, where you can move them around or do whatever you want with them, and whenever you want with them, and change the number and the kind. With hunting, you can allow people to shoot male animals versus female animals, mature animals, young animals. You can use that to some extent to adjust the stalking rate of an elk, but it's a little less exact. And then you've got the scope. Well, both of these are interested in eating plants that they want to eat. So they're not going to eat redwood trees or things that maybe not sage with its volatile compounds, but they'll eat a lot of things. And they're selective about it. They're going to pick what they eat. They're not just going to eat everything in front of them, like a weed whacker or a lawnmower. And the rate of change that they can cause is I would just call it medium. It's not going to change the environment overnight or cause the ecosystem to change overnight, but it does change over time, especially if you try to make a change with either kind of herbivory. And what do? They both do similar things. They can defoliate, they can change species, especially in California, perennial and shrub species. They trample, they redistribute nutrients, taking them from a vast area and concentrating them in urine or manure. They are a vector for disease. One of the problems we have with domestic livestock is that they can bring disease to wild populations. It also happens the other way. I don't feel we need to talk too much about animals transmitting disease, because they do it even to people, right? And they can introduce invasive plants on their fur and carry them around. They have some greenhouse gas release over time. Both of them do. They're all ruminants. And they can reduce fire hazard by consuming biomass. So that's how we might sum up some of the effects and compare the two. Now, if we go to fire, we have wildfire and we have prescribed fire, similar to the two kinds of herbivory. We have very little control over wildfire. We're trying, right? But we don't have very much control over it. And they'll burn almost anything if they get hot enough, right? A certain amount of heat, they create their own drying oven. Even if the plants around your house are green, by the time a big firestorm gets to them, they'll be dry. So will you. And they're not that selective because they're burning so hot. They'll burn pretty much anything if it's a really hot wildfire, and they change things pretty quickly, right? You can change a forest to bare ground in a few days, right? So they're fast. You can have erosion, species loss, a pulse of greenhouse gases. They release a lot of greenhouse gases. Loss of vegetation for a period of time, but release of fire following species. There are a lot of species that do better after a fire, that only come up after a fire. And there are examples of those fires creating more biodiversity in the end by creating more open environments. Certainly the Native Americans knew that. They used, I guess we could call it prescribed fire. They burned intentionally when they wanted to. And they could get more biodiversity, more game, a great way to attract large ungulates like deer and elk and bison. And, you know, the Great Plains, famous use of fire to attract bison, because freshly growing grass after a fire is way more yummy than nasty old grass. So fire can be really good for wildlife. And we'll read a paper later about a couple of researchers that have explored how to use fire with grazing to manage an environment. Okay, then we have prescribed fire. Control is medium. I'm calling it medium. I think a real prescribed burn advocate would say high. So I might be biased here. But the fact is that sometimes prescribed fires go awry. They will burn pretty much all material, although you can control what they burn by controlling the timing, the fuel conditions. But if you burn when things are relatively wet, not as many things are going to burn. If you can burn with a really low intensity fire, it won't burn big trees. I mean, think about just putting a log in your fireplace, just a log, and trying to set it on fire. It's really hard without kindling. And the same is true in the ecosystem. We really need that kindling, which would be grass, brush, shrubs, dead material, downed logs that are kind of rotten, you know, and dry. All of those things, those are fuel. We think of them as nature, but they're fuel for somebody studying fire. And again, prescribed fire can cause fast change. It can alter species, it releases gases, it can cause a loss of vegetation for a period of time, but it can release fire following species, and it can reduce fire hazard, and it too can increase biodiversity. All of these can, by creating more open situations for plants to grow. Plants that might normally be inhibited or smothered by the dominant species are suddenly free. And then weather. Oh man, we don't control that, right? It can have us a pretty big range of effects. Selectivity is pretty medium. Weather can benefit some species and not others. I guess that's what I mean here. The rate is pretty medium. You can have a hurricane, that would be fast, but you can also have a drought, relatively slow. You can have excess rain, etc. And they do cause erosion and loss of vegetation when there's a drought or a lot of rain. Yeah, and depending on how the rain falls and how the weather happens and the temperatures and everything, it will be selective in terms of what species benefit. Same is true for climate change. Surely there are many species that really enjoy a hot climate. But for those that don't, they're in trouble. Can we prevent and control climate change? Boy, we better figure it out. Of course, it's the whole world gets affected by climate change. Selectivity for the same reasons is medium, and it's so slow that people are not so aware of it. But events like the last couple of weeks make us aware of it even more. And species change, extinctions, and so on can be caused by climate change. I should add wildfires and drought. In the paper by Bestelmeyer on novel ecosystems that's in your readings, it's a nice, short, great little paper, and it talks about novel ecosystems, and that's ecosystems that have been created this century, maybe last century, but ecosystems that are new, that don't have an evolutionary history, a long history of evolution and adaptation that we can study, that don't have a long record of management and use. including plants maybe from other parts of the world. And California is one such place, and I would refer to it as a novel ecosystem. It has irreparably changed our grasslands, and they're not going back, right? They're not going back. Nobody's going to get rid of wild oats. We might be able to make small phase changes in our grassland, like maybe a little more wild oats, maybe a little more perennial grasses, but we're not going to be making huge dramatic changes because so many of the drivers in our grassland are not things we can control, like fire and, well, I mean fire, like weather and fire and rain. Okay, so let's look at, Bestelmeyer has this model for how to manage novel ecosystems or how to think about them. So you have a novel ecosystem and you're thinking out of an intervention like that slide I showed of Larky Park, where they've regrown the grassland in neat rows. So to decide this, you know, I studied a computer code when I was an undergraduate, and we use these kinds of models to discuss code or to describe code. But anyway, what kind of environmental intervention do we want to make? Well, how much has the environment changed? How different is this novel ecosystem from the one we had before? If it's not very different, well, it's pretty typical of ecosystems in the United States. So maybe if the degree of change has been pretty minor, maybe we can just use management and conservation practices to manage it and encourage the native species if that's a goal. But if it's minor, that's what we might do. Now, if the change is huge, which it is in California, by the way, we have to decide, do we have a motive to want to go back to what's described here and in our ecological site description for annual grasslands in California? Do we want to recover that historic state? The state in California was a lot more perennial grasses, some native annual grasses, and probably a lot of native forbs throughout California that are now somewhat, I would sort of say, smothered, but dominated by plants like wild oats, by really big annual grasses largely from the Fertile Crescent of the Mediterranean basin. So do we want to recover the historical state? Do we want to go back? Well, here's kind of where I part company with a lot of people, ecologists in California. No, I don't want to. I don't think it's possible, and I don't think that it's worth expending a lot of effort to try to do that, because California is what it is. It's changed. We use it for all the abundant things it produces, and we can deal with it as it is. Well, then the next question is, are we going to keep it a novel ecosystem? Here I am. Yes. No. Well, if we're not, we're probably going to have to do some ecological engineering. Larky Park, those striped plots of Stipopulchra is an example. They have really engineered that site, right? They killed everything that was on it before. They weed it all the time. They planted it with the species they wanted. That's engineering. That's not managing to create change. That's changing. It's like crop production. Crop production is ecosystem engineering. Get rid of all the other plants, plant one species, give it the water it needs, etc. That's engineering. Okay? Most rangelands, it's just not worth it. There's huge areas. Until we get some new technique and want to do it, there's not much point. But if we do want to recover the historical state, we decide that right here, we have to think, is recovery feasible? Well, maybe not. So then we do partial restoration, and we see people trying to do that in California, encourage the perennial grasses in areas where they grow well, and so on. Just do some partial restoration out on the rangeland, out on the grassland, out on the woodland. You know you're not going to get it all back to the historic state, but it's probably not going to go back there. If it is possible to go back to the historic state, Then we do what we call restoration. Now, this is a little challengeable, right? Especially if we consider climate change, because climate change has changed our environment. Does the historic state still work? That's a question we have to ask. We might put another question here. Is recovery feasible given climate change, right? Need to think about that. A lot of places are drier and hotter than they were, or hotter and wetter than they were when they were in this grassland historic state that was dominated by native perennial grasses like our purple needlegrass. Oh, and here's one. This is at a place out in eastern Contra Costa County. And this place is grazed by sheep, and for whatever reason has a tremendous number of stipopulchres, and maybe looks somewhat like our grasslands used to look. It's probably related to soil conditions. There's a lot of phosphorus in the soil and perhaps some other things going on, but it really gives you an idea of what a grassland might have looked like. Now there are little annual grasses in between these clumps, and by the end of the season they may be taller than the clumps, but right now you can see them. It looks like a bunchgrass prairie, which is what we hypothesize, especially near the coast in coastal California, where it's a little moister, might have been dominant. In the Central Valley, we think it was more flowers, and John Muir has a beautiful little essay about the flowers of the Central Valley. Don't know if that was because that was what was there, or if the tremendous amount of grazing at that time facilitated more flowers, because livestock are not crazy about flowers, really. They like grass. But there doesn't seem to be that much evidence that that was a bunchgrass prairie. It might have been a giant field of flowers. Intriguing to think about. He calls them the bee gardens. We just know too little. We need a time machine. Now, this is an area that's had no livestock, but there's no native perennials there. Really, the main species that's left is wild oats, which you know is an introduced non-native, pure monocultural stand. Of course, there's some other plants in there. But this is exemplary of the fact that in terms of our ecosystem state as a novel ecosystem, we've crossed a threshold, in my opinion, where its going back will be very, very hard, and there may not be a good reason to do it, actually, at this point in time. Since the weather's getting warmer, the annual grasses may be better able to survive in many places anyway. But this is the novel ecosystem of California. In many areas, these are much more diverse. This is a remarkably undiverse area. And the problem is that wild oats get really big and quickly shade out a lot of other species if they get going. They also need more consistent watering than a lot of other species. So in a year when it's droughty, they won't get so big, and maybe another species will be dominant. But since it's annual, it changes every year, as I illustrated with my pictures from our sampling at the Tajon Ranch. This is definitely a grass year, one with consistent rain throughout the winter. Now, a paper by Jones et al. Called Ecosystem Engineering that I'm really fond of talks about how some species create habitat for other species. And they talk about beavers building ponds that then other species can use. But they say some interesting things. They say ecologists have paid surprisingly little attention to how environments are created and maintained, and they don't consider the role of engineering in habitat modification, creation, and maintenance. Now they're talking about another wild species, a beaver. Well, we can apply this to humans. In other words, ecologists have actually paid surprisingly little attention to how environments are created and maintained. Well, look at Native Americans. They created the North American environment, had a huge effect on the California environment by their management practices, which was often burning. Also some transplanting and cropping and other things, but really created this environment. And our ecologists were oblivious until fairly recently, most of them. Oblivious to the importance of fire, because a lot of people were following the equilibrium ideas. Fire was a disturbance, a bad thing. There are still people out there who feel that way. Can't accept an environment with something like fire having a management effect. That's a disturbance. The ecosystem needs to naturally go to climax. And that fit really well with environmentalists like John Muir, who wanted us to just leave the wilderness, as they called it, because they were oblivious, as Muir called it, the wilderness, which is a term of the white man, in the words of a Native American friend, needs to be untouched. And in the philosophy of the equilibrium-based succession idea, you need to not disturb the vegetation either. And that powerful synergy, it's brought us to this point, in my opinion. And then they don't consider the role of engineering in habitat modification, creation, and maintenance. Well, there are a number of endangered species, about 40% of our threatened endangered species, that benefit from the human activity of grazing livestock, which is a form of habitat engineering. So these things really, I feel they need to be resolved. They'll never be resolved, but we need to think about management and taking care of ecosystems more than protecting them from everything. And so here I said humans can be somewhat of an engineer, just like beavers and other wildlife. Now, native bunch grass, here it is in a sparse annual grassland matrix at the Hastings Reservation. That's how we see it often here now. Mixed with annual grasses, not gone in most places, in many places, where the land has been farmed, and a lot of the land around here was homesteaded for a while before they realized it's very hard to farm without irrigation here. But if it hasn't been cultivated and it's on natural soil, you tend to find some grasses scattered in the grassland. So even though this is a novel ecosystem, there's still native elements, and you can find them if you know where to look. This is Filary, Erodium botrys. This is 1 week after a rain. Now, when does it rain in California? It's hopefully going to start any moment. We need it. But probably not till October or November, unfortunately. A significant rain. And since most of our vegetation, our herbaceous vegetation, our grasses and forbs are annual, they're not going to grow until fall either. They're just going to be seeds sitting in the soil or on top of the soil. Erodium botrys, or Filary, is geranium-like, and it's got a crane's beak seed that makes a little drill. You may have had the pleasure of stepping on one of those one time, and it drills itself into the ground. Pretty cool. This is how it looks. This is how, we called it Nacella then, but this is how Stiplepulchra, purple needlegrass, you can always count on the common name, looks after 6 months. A little slower, right? It'll be interesting to see how that turns out in our grass experiment, because it comes up sooner. So will it be bigger than the Avena by the end of the semester? We got to find out. And we know if it's perennial, probably going to put more into root growth, but all of the grasses need root growth because of the way the grassland dries out so frequently. Okay. So this selection capacity of herbivory can be used to manage for biodiversity. And I'm going to give you a case study here. We saw this, livestock pick and choose, and we're going to use that selective capacity. So here is a reserve, near a reserve. This is called a grazed part and an ungrazed part. And in the grazed part, this overstory of thick grass, some of which is still there from last year and just rotting, has been removed by the cows. This is in a nature reserve where they use grazing to engineer the habitat. Now, it's an annual grassland. These are all annual plants. And so grazing will influence them in 1 year, but not necessarily across 2 years. In other words, this is an annual effect, manipulating the species composition and the structure of the grassland. But unlike in other places where the grassland is mostly perennial, here we can't really expect the effect to last. In the summer, all of these things will be dead, seeds will be in the ground, and we might have some little effect on what happens in the following year. And I'll tell you one of the mechanisms we use for that, but it's not guaranteed, because what's going to control it the most? The weather. We have seeds in the soil that will last decades. So even if 1 year you don't produce very many seeds, there's plenty left. We got seeds. If you want to try to engineer this to a total perennial grassland, you need to use herbicides and kill everything and then dig out the soil. I mean, I've seen studies where they dug down 3 feet and took out all the soil in order to get rid of the annual grasses. But as I mentioned, they come back. A little expensive for all of California. This is Coyote Ridge. This place is managed for the checker spot butterfly. I have a picture of it later. And it has been done really well. A guy named Stephen Weiss wrote a paper about this area. It's near the freeway, and a lot of nitrogen gets deposited from exhaust. And he hypothesized that that was causing more annual grasses to flourish. The annual grasses, like wild oats, really love a lot of fertility and really good soil. So they grow best there. This site has a lot of native, tough, difficult soil, serpentine, high in nickel. And so normally the plants here are pretty safe from the non-native species because they don't do well on our special endemic California soils. They're not adapted like our plants are. And so unfortunately, what he saw happening is nitrogen is being deposited in the soil, enabling more growth of the annual grasses that then compete with these natives. They're pretty short, our natives, but they're pretty. And that was in turn making life hard for the butterfly. And the butterfly was suffering, and then they reintroduced cattle. It's a beautiful story. The natives started to flourish again, and the butterfly was happy and also started to flourish. It's quite a nice place to visit. Down there near Morgan Hill, Santa Clara County, if you get a chance. It's an outside activity. But this happens in the spring because the plants start growing in the fall, right? When the rain germinates the seeds, and then they come up in the spring. Some of these are little bulbs that are perennial, but again, they're under the soil a lot of the year. So, and nothing really likes to eat them, but you would never see them if this was all non-native grass. So this article was partly because, whether the nitrogen thing or not is what's going on, and there are many places where people think it is a big factor. Some places, some would argue that it's not in some places, but it still shows that using an entity like grazing to remove biomass can help these native species and native plants. Now, fire might be effective too, but it's a little harder to apply a fire. And it might do some damage to the perennials that are in there, more so than grazing, since grazing is more selective and the native perennials tend to be bulbs and aren't very attractive. That was a mouthful. This paper is partly in response to what happened at the preserve at Stanford. I think it's called the Jepson Preserve, where they removed grazing, and within a few years, that preserve, part of it was for the checker spot butterfly, and within a few years, the butterflies started to disappear. And People wrote learned articles about how this was caused by climate change. This was caused by this or that. None of them thought about grazing until finally a historian named Richard White looked at the records and thought, the removal of grazing and the disappearance of this endangered butterfly coincide. Interesting. So they've been trying to study what can be done there. I don't know. But with preserves like this, the butterfly is okay. So often, the role of herbivory is not discovered until someone removes it. And then what they were trying to protect by removing it disappears. That happened on the Muir Preserve in Walnut Creek. They didn't want grazing on the Muir Heritage Trust Reserve. They had a huge stand of these precious wildflowers, goldfields, natives. Why put a cow out there? They'll step on them, which they will. They don't particularly like to eat them, but they will step on them. Life, that's how it is. If you're a plant, you get stepped on. But anyway, they didn't want the cows in there stepping and pooping, and the goldfields disappeared. The neighbors got up in arms and said, look, there's like 3 of these things left. There used to be thousands. What is going on? You've got to bring back the cows. And they did. And true story, the goldfields are fine, flourishing, and very common, beautiful yellow blooms, given right weather. In fact, people have studied grazing intensity with different outcomes based on the amount of dry matter you leave behind. Dry matter simply means things that died because the cows didn't eat them, that the cows left behind, or the deer or the elk. You can do it for any of them. We call that RDM, residual dry matter. So here's really a lot of residual dry matter. We call it dry matter because most of it's dead, right, and dry in the summer, like it is right now. And it's eagerly burning anyway. The dead grass left after grazing. And this again, I want to stress, is a 1-year deal. The next year may be completely different. But if you in the fall leave behind this much or this much or this much dry matter, it's going to have consequences, because that will affect what seeds grow, is one thing. If there's a thick cover like that, there's not that many plants that can reseed and come up through that. There are a couple species. You tend to see them. They're kind of, they have a lot of stems, long stems. They're creeping plants, and they're lying on top of that dead grass, because they can get up through it and then spread on top of the tall grass, like your lawn grasses. And then in the middle, we've always recommended the middle for 2 reasons. One, it allows a lot of plants to flourish and flourish well. Wild oats comes up through that, and you might say to me, Lynn, why wild oats? That's the evil non-native. Well, when people were managing for livestock production, or when they are managing for livestock production, that tremendous growth of wild oats is very valuable, as are some of the other non-natives. So they would manage in here for some of the best grazing species. And when you take it down to here, that would obviously work really well for fire control. So would this. Anything that's flat and laying down is not nearly as flammable as things that are standing up, because there's less air mixed in with this flat stuff. So these 2 treatments are pretty good for fire, but this is very susceptible to erosion, right? My thought is you could graze down pretty low like this and still do a heck of a lot for fire management. And you could do it in small areas where you know there's going to be a lot of fire risk. You don't have to do it everywhere. But anyway, RDM experiments are interesting and fun. But again, we need to remember we're not managing for years into the future. This is going to affect what happens when it starts raining. It's not going to affect what happens 2 years later in California, unless you do this and you have a lot of erosion. When you lose soil, that's going to affect the outcome. You're changing the abiotic conditions of the site, which is possible with fire or grazing and erosion. So we don't want to do that. So here is where these low intensities of RDM were left. The low levels of residual dry matter was left. Looks like the place at Coyote Ridge. And here's a very high level. There's some perennial bench grass growing in there, and which is typical to have a few scattered in the grassland. And here we have so much RDM. We see that a lot when you're driving down the freeway. When the grass is tall and then falls over, we call that lodging, and it makes a thatch that's very hard for new plants to penetrate. That's one of the problems. It's really good for rodents. Rodents love that. They're safe from hawks and eagles and stuff, and they live under there. But to get seeds from these kind of plants, they need those seeds. And out here in the grassland, this is a grazed area, they have to run out. I tend to see hawks and eagles hanging out in places like this because they know these animals have bred up to almost unbearable numbers in here, and they're going to run out to get food, and they nail them. So again, this is a within season, within year effect, not a long-term one. If you left all the RDM from this year, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference the next year, right? Not making permanent changes. The only thing you could make a permanent change in is the perennial species, or a long-term change like this, by somehow pulling them out or stomping them to death or grazing them repeatedly, very heavily, or burning them with a very hot fire hot enough to hurt their roots. But the nice thing about a grassland, let's not forget, the roots survive a fire usually. They don't burn that hot when it's just grass. And so it's good for sequestering carbon under grassland. There's been some articles about that. Let's go on. But a fire is going to take it down, right? It's going to give you this, not this, just like herbivory. So this effect can be achieved either way. Both are going to have effects that are side effects. Cows will redistribute nutrients by, pooping and peeing. Cows may trample things. Fire may burn too hot in some areas or not hot enough. And fire may change the top of the surface of the soil. Sometimes it releases oils from the plants that affect the top of the soil. And fire will burn everything, not just the grass so much. So if you're managing this and you want to keep the grass down, a cow is going to be a better method. If you're just trying to get rid of all this stuff and open the grassland up or reduce fire hazard, you can do that with a fire. You can reduce the fire hazard with both.